There are texts in which Paul is unambiguously clear, and there are texts where it's certainly possible to read his language in more than one way. But I find that those who want to introduce a splitting of the Shema, a redefinition of Jewish monotheism, tend to try to drive a wedge into certain ambiguities or passages that are perhaps less clear, and then struggle to make sense of some which are, I think, arguably far less ambiguous. One that I think of is 1 Corinthians 15. Paul talks about God being the one God subordinating all things to the Son, which gives the Son a really exalted status over all things except for the one God. And Paul's emphatic about that and emphasizes that the Christ, the Son, will then hand all things over to the Father so that God, the one God, may be all in all. And so there's an ultimate subordination of the Son and of the Messiah, this human appointed agent of God, to the one God. We also find in Philippians 2, however one understands the start of that passage, in Philippians 2, 6-11, the ending features the one God bestowing upon the exalted Jesus the name that is above every name. And it seems to me that for a Jewish monotheist, the name above every name could only be the divine name. We see God appointing a figure. For instance, you have the angel Yahuel, right, who's mentioned in a Jewish work, the Apocalypse of Abraham. But we get this imagery elsewhere. The one God can appoint an agent to represent the one God so fully that that agent bears the divine name, but is not confused with that agent precisely because there's no doubt that this figure is subordinate, separate, and appointed. When we consider those kinds of passages and then come back to the passage in 1 Corinthians, I think that it provides an important framework. It's still relevant to consider how Jews in Paul's time and around Paul's time spoke about the one God, the oneness of God, and spoke about the Shema. They didn't have the term monotheism yet, and so oftentimes they summed up the Shema, their core statement of faith, simply with the words, one God, God is one, things of this sort. And so when Paul said there is one God and one Lord, it seems to me that within Jewish monotheism, that language has a natural interpretation as one God, that's the Shema, and one Lord who is appointed to rule over all things except for the one God, and is appointed to that role by the one God. And if we read it that way, then what Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians 15 and what Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 8 mesh together perfectly, both internally within the letter and within the framework of Paul's theology, as well as fitting together nicely with the Jewish monotheism that Paul is emphatic that he is calling non-Jewish converts to his message to adopt. That provides, I think, a very cohesive and coherent explanation. When one starts to get away from that, I think one has to then do very awkward things with Paul's call to Gentiles to worship one God, the God of Israel, in connection with the one Messiah. And one has to do difficult things with other passages in Paul's letters, and even with that passage. And so those are some of the key reasons why I read it as I do. And I'm hopeful that that case may be found persuasive by increasing numbers of fellow scholars in this field.